Welcome to Middle East Dialogues, a series of conversations with leading scholars and writers, produced by the University of Denver's Center for Middle East Studies. Your host for this episode is Nader Hashmi, the director of the center and associate professor at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. Our guest for this episode is Henri Barkey. Barkey is the director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. His publications include Reluctant Neighbor, Turkey's Role in the Middle East, Turkey in the Arab Spring, Implications for Turkish Foreign Policy from a Transatlantic Perspective, and Turkey's Kurdish Question.
Henri Barkey, thank you for joining us here today in our series on Middle East Dialogues. And the first question that I have for you has to do with the July 15th coup. It's about 2.5 months since the coup has passed. And I'm wondering now if we have a better sense of who was really behind the coup, who the forces were that were responsible for instigating this coup.
The truth is, we really do not know. We don't know because the government came out and the day after the coup attempt failed said this was instigated and run by Fethullah Gulen, the cleric who lives in Pennsylvania. But the truth is that everything that the government has said since, and everything the Turkish press, which is mostly controlled by the government, has said, is that it's Fethullah Gulen, but they have shown almost no evidence for it. There is some circumstantial evidence that maybe some people associated with the Gulen movement were involved, but there are also many anomalies. Anomalies such as 149 generals were dismissed or imprisoned after the coup. And when you look at the number of troops that participated in the attempted coup d'etat, it's only 10,000. So you don't need 149 generals to run 10,000 soldiers. So you start asking yourself, so why so many officers were dismissed, senior officers? And then, so were there other sympathetic officers who were maybe not Gülenists but were Kemalists? So we don't know, and the sad thing is I don't think we'll ever know because the government in Turkey now is doing everything it can in its power to suppress evidence, to suppress investigative journalism. There is no investigative journalism. I mean, all the newspapers essentially repeat what the government says and that they don't. The idea of investigative journalism has ceased to exist in Turkey.
And could you talk about the accusations that have been leveled directly against you? I mean, I'm sure you must have spent some time at night just sort of thinking, how did I get sort of caught up in this story? Why was I sort of identified as the key architect for allegedly staging this coup? Could you talk about that whole part of this narrative?
So by pure coincidence, I was in Istanbul at the time of the coup. I had just come in to do a small workshop on Iran and its neighbors. And I did it in Istanbul in part because I like doing things in Istanbul. And I was doing it actually on an island which is 45 minutes from Istanbul, which is a really beautiful island. And this was a conference that I organized. I decided the venue and everything. And I also did it in Istanbul because it's easier to bring people from the region instead of flying them all to Washington, where I am. So we had a welcoming dinner on the 15th of July, and after the dinner we started hearing some on television and Twitter that some stuff was happening in Istanbul and Ankara. We didn't think much of it initially, but then it turned out it was a coup. But I stayed in Istanbul. Our workshop continued because it was about Iran, it wasn't about Turkey. Workshop ended, I stayed in Istanbul for a couple of days, and then I went home to Washington. 2 days after I left, then this whole barrage of accusations started. And so there's been these lurid stories about that I was there with 13 CIA agents organizing the coup. And this has become now part of the folklore in Turkey. Everybody knows about it. Everybody assumes that this is what happened. It is because there was a concerted campaign instigated by some part of the Turkish government. I know it's the Turkish government because some of the journalists were given very, very precise information. This was a small workshop that nobody knew about. It wasn't a big conference that we advertised and were looking for audiences. On the contrary. So who would have known that I was there? One. Two, they gave the journalists the precise moment I went through passport control, like 4 or 5 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Who has that information other than security agencies? So you could see that this was being, and the newspapers that pushed for it were the ones that are very close to the government. So why me? Look, I've always been a little bit controversial in Turkey because I was one of the first to write about the Kurdish question in Turkey, and they never liked it. So that's one reason. Two, because I worked in the U.S. government in the State Department, so they associate very macabre intentions to that. And thirdly, I think there was an attempt to blame the United States for the coup. So the only way you could blame the United States is one, say, oh, Fethullah Gulen instigated it, but Fethullah Gulen is in Pennsylvania, and you don't really have essentially a direct linkage because the guy is in Pennsylvania and the coup is taking place. But if you point to Henri Barkey, who actually happened to be there, and since everybody says, oh, he was there on the 15th, that it must be sinister. So this is a way of saying, you see, the United States was involved. And there is a very serious attempt at associating the coup with the United States. And so I became essentially cannon fodder for the government's propaganda attempt at trying to pin the blame on the United States.
Just out of curiosity, do you have any sense of who within the Turkish government might have concocted this theory against you? Is it coming from the president's office, the prime minister, the security services, any one individual that might have, obviously they know something, they've been tracking you, but is there any sense of, where the origins of this came from?
I have no evidence. The only thing I know is that a journalist friend of mine who was talking to Turkish intelligence said that the Turkish intelligence, it's called MIT in Turkish, TNIO in English, they said to him that they had nothing to do with it, that it was police intelligence. That's the only thing I have going. But I do know that the police has questioned all the Turks who participated in my conference, because there were Turks, since I was doing it with a think tank in Turkey collaboratively, because I needed a collaborator to do the ground preparations, hotels and stuff like that, plus for intellectual content as well. And so they all got interrogated. There were 2 Turks from another university, and apparently at least one of them, or probably 2, it's actually a husband and wife team, they got suspended from their jobs just for actually being there. I mean, they were invited to participate. I mean, but the police has been tracking down, I've heard from other friends, looking at which restaurants I had dinner after these events, etc. But I suspect it's coming from somewhere in the presidential office, not by the president, but somewhere from his PR folks. But that's an educated guess, but I have no proof of anything.
Right. Okay, could you give our viewers just a sense of the extent and the breadth and the depth of the crackdown that is underway in Turkey today, post-July 15th?
So the crackdown is multifaceted. The crackdown, first of all, affected the military. As I said, 149 generals and admirals were, but in addition to that, another 4,000 officers and non-commissioned officers were kicked out. There are stories, and I saw one today, that the size of the Turkish military has shrunk between the coup and today by 150,000. This is a story that came out in the Turkish press today. I haven't had a chance to validate it, but it is, I don't think they would have made it up. They make up a lot of things, but this is not something they would have made up. So in addition to that, they've now fired 100,000 people from the public roles. I mean, from the bureaucracy, from public service. They fired 15,000 teachers. When I say teachers, these are primary and middle school and high school teachers. That's directed at Kurds because the Kurdish regions of Turkey have suffered the bulk of these dismissals. So Kurdish kids don't have teachers to go to at school, so they're going to be at least a year behind as a result of this at this rate. In the town of Diyarbakir, which is a major Kurdish city, 4,000 teachers in one go were just dismissed. So how do you replace 4,000 teachers overnight? You can't. So this is going to take a very long time, and they're going to have to send teachers from other parts of the country, which means that kids will lose a year. Then you have journalists, at least 125 journalists are behind bars. You have intellectuals, authors, economists, a lot of authors who are now in jail, and they're not Gülenists. Most of them actually happen to be left or center-left people. Some of them are sympathetic to the Kurds. So they are in jail, and because there's emergency law, they don't get to see a judge. They are. I have actually a lot of friends who are now in jail. I mean, journalist friends, and one author. Then they also fired a great deal of academics, and that's only the beginning. They slowly are purging academia, and they're not purging it because of the coup. The people they're purging are people who signed a petition 9 months ago calling on the Turkish government to start the peace negotiations with the Kurds again. So that was seen as being treasonous. But they're using the emergency law and the fact that under emergency conditions, Parliament doesn't have much to say. Not that the Parliament would say that much in this case. And so there's very little these academics can do. In addition to that, they are now also they've closed down a whole bunch of newspapers, and the latest wave is television stations, radio stations, mostly those that are associated with either the Kurdish opposition or the Alevi opposition. The Alevis are kind of like the Alawites in Syria, an offshoot of Islam. And they tend to be much more secular, they tend to be much more Kemalist, Atatürkist. So even television stations that only broadcast children programs were closed. So the crackdown, the 15 universities which were associated with the Gülen movement have been closed down completely. Everybody's fired. And the final thing is that they've taken over a very large number of businesses that were deemed to be part of the Fethullah Gülen network, that these were business folks who were seen to be pro-Fethullah Gülen, who had maybe donated to the Gülen movement. But yes, they were seen as, they were part of this larger faith-based community. But some of them are huge conglomerates. I mean, really enormous conglomerates with thousands and thousands of workers. They were the owners were hauled off to jail, and the businesses were taken over by the government. So now the Turkish government has actually a very large number of businesses it has to run, and clearly it's not going to do a very good job. But so you can see just by this list, I mean, how extensive this crackdown is.
Just out of curiosity, is this crackdown worse than the previous crackdowns following other coup attempts in Turkey, or does it?
The 1980 coup was more dramatic in the sense that they went far after intellectuals and left-wingers, but it was narrower. It was deeper and narrower. This one is much wider in terms of...
In your lecture yesterday on Turkish politics, in trying to explain the shift to authoritarianism in Turkey under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, you quoted the famous aphorism that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What did you mean by that?
Well, because when you look at the trajectory of Erdogan, first as prime minister and then president, he started off essentially as someone who listened to others, who had wide views being offered to him. He had a group of, shall we say, wise colleagues, the people with whom he had formed the party. There was about maybe 10, 12, 14 of them. I mean, these were all senior, distinguished politicians, and he was the leader among them, but he also was deferential to them. I mean, they all had important cabinet positions, whether it was economy or foreign ministry with Abdullah Gül, who later would become president, justice, and so on and so forth. And none of them is around today. They've all been eliminated. They've all been sent away. You don't hear from them. Sometimes you see their pictures in the papers, but by and large, you don't hear a peep. And so now, from where he governed or tried to govern on the basis of consensus, now it's by fiat. Now it's him, and now he's surrounded himself with a coterie of individuals who owe their career, their everything to him, and who will never say anything that he doesn't want to hear. So they tend to echo what he says, amplify what he says, and today in Turkey, there is no other source of power or authority. I mean, if a judge wants to decide one way and Erdogan doesn't want it to happen, boom, it won't happen. Right?
And to what extent is the absence of a credible electoral alternative that could challenge the AK Party at the polls part of the problem of the shift toward authoritarianism?
That's actually a very good question, in the sense that in Turkey, the main opposition party, which has been in existence since almost the beginning of the Republic, it's called the Republican People's Party. It was the party that was formed by Atatürk, which tends to be center-left, statist, but at the same time amazingly conservative. It hasn't really changed its ideas since the 1930s almost. But it is a party that is quite out of touch with the bulk of the population, and it is a party that is still very, very much wedded to a very strict view of secularism. And it's been led with people who are not very imaginative, not very charismatic, except for one period in the late 70s. We had a gentleman by the name of Bülent Ecevit, who, because he was prime minister during the Cyprus invasion, and he ordered the Turkish troops onto Cyprus, became very popular. So he had this charisma, if you want, but he is the only one of the Turkish, of this party's leaders who had any legs, if you want, in the public. So today, the Republican People's Party is one of these parties that knows it will never win an election, and somehow. Sometimes I feel like they're very happy with the place they're in, at least the leader. What does he do? He just gets up, he says a few things on television, he has his breakfast, he has say more things on television, he has his lunch, takes a nap, takes on television, and then he has no responsibility. And there is a hard core that will always vote for that party, A, because they tend to be secularist, B, because they tend to be Kemalist in general, and C, because they don't like the AKP. But they haven't had power now for a very, very long time. And certainly they've never had power by themselves. Nobody can, I mean, maybe since the 60s. So I don't know if they know what to do if they were suddenly to win. But the only real party that is an opposition party that is actually quite dynamic is the Kurdish party, which is the People's Democracy Party. And it is dynamic because it is also led by a very, very good politician by the name of Selahattin Demirtas, who is very telegenic, very quick on his feet, comes up with his wonderful turn of sentences, But what is happening recently is that you see that the Turkish television networks or newspapers completely ignore him. Or if they will talk, if the papers will talk about him, it's just a little tiny little picture of him in the bottom of the page, but he doesn't, his speeches don't get covered, whereas Erdogan and everybody from the AKP, they're constantly covered, etc. So you can say, okay, the president will be covered all the time, but main opposition, these opposition parties. And there's a third opposition party which is split at the moment, which is a nationalist, kind of almost neo-fascist party, and that has now decided, at least its leadership, has decided to back Erdogan, both on the emergency rule and also on policies with respect to the Kurds.
Yeah.
But they are hemorrhaging. I mean, they have a very hardcore group that will support them. Maybe it's 8% of the population. Right. But I think in the next election they will disappear.
There was some talk not too long ago that given Erdogan's authoritarian shift, that there might be some hope that the AK party would split and perhaps a more liberal wing under someone like perhaps Abdullah Gül would lead a breakaway party that could form some sort of center coalition that would challenge the old AK party, bringing in other elements of society. Are there any serious prospects of that happening?
Absolutely not.
Why not?
Many reasons. For one thing, Erdogan is very popular, right? And the coup attempt has made him even more popular. But he has established an amazing hold on the press and on the emerging business community. And the AKP coffers are full. You can't challenge the AKP unless you have serious money behind you, especially if you're coming from the AKP itself. Erdogan would make mincemeat out of those people. There's absolutely no hope.
Right. A final question on Turkish-American relations. You said something last night that I hope you can elaborate on, where you sort of articulated an argument that the United States should be much more robust and forceful in pushing back against some of the extreme rhetoric that we hear coming out of the Turkish government today, the anti-Americanism, the conspiracy theory, the incoherence of sort of the narrative. And the United States should draw its own red lines and say, look, this is something that we're not going to tolerate anymore. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. I think what's happening today in terms of the U.S.-Turkish relationship is that the American, foreign policy establishment in the government, or the foreign policy folks in the government, have decided that Turkey is a very difficult country to deal with, especially this current leadership. So they've gone through, decided to essentially go for a policy that I call the path of least resistance. Right? The Turks push, they give them a little bit just to pacify them and so that the Turks will leave them alone. But in the process, they let the Turks get away not only with this very anti-American rhetoric, with trying to sabotage American initiatives, and also with these really terrible human rights violations. You'll say, okay, there are human rights violations in many other countries, but Turkey is different. Turkey is an ally. Turkey is a member of the NATO alliance. Turkey is a country that the United States says should become a member of the European Union. You cannot have that discourse and have people go to jail because they apparently sent subliminal messages on television. I mean, it doesn't make sense for the United States to say nothing about these violations when at the same time, when you look at whether it is the American president or the Secretary of State or the bureaucracy in general, always talks about what a democratic country Turkey is and that it is essentially a model for other societies. No, it's not a model for other societies if you send people to jail because they put money in the wrong bank, or they said something that Erdogan didn't like. Yeah. Right? And I think the United States is doing damage to its own reputation here, and it is also it also, in a way, indirectly encourages the government to do in Turkey to be even more repressive, because if United States is the only, United States in Europe, but most of the United States is the only power, the only voice, if you want, in the world that Erdogan kind of pays attention to. And if that voice is silent, then Erdogan will say, okay, there's nothing that stops him from that. Because clearly in Turkey, especially with the way the press is today, when the opposition press is virtually non-existent, he doesn't hear anything that's in opposition to what he's doing. So, when the United States is silent, that means he thinks everything is hunky-dory. So in a way, we are encouraging him. I'm not arguing that the United States should bang the doors and say, I'm not going to deal with you unless you improve. But some constructive criticism, right, that is sustained, right, would go a very, very long way.
Right. Particularly in terms of the long-term relationship that we're thinking about.
Right. I mean, think for one moment, if President Obama were to say, there's this guy, Ahmet Altan, who's in jail, who's an author, who's written all these novels. I'd like to read one of his books.
Do you think that would have a resonance in terms of Turkish politics?
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful. One last sort of big picture question that has to do with this whole theme of authoritarianism. Christopher Debeleg wrote a long essay in The Guardian about a month ago, where he observed that the turn to authoritarianism in Turkey suggests that Erdogan is less an aberration, but really is the vanguard of a broader global trend, where liberal democracy is being replaced by majoritarian democracy. And he lists a number of countries: Narendra Modi in India, Netanyahu in Israel, Orban in Hungary, across Europe, the rise of populist parties. Nicolas Sarkozy is sort of trying to come back to power on a very populist platform. Even here in the United States, Donald Trump. So when you look at these trends, how different really is Erdogan's, populist, nationalist, authoritarian rhetoric when it seems like it's part of a broader pattern?
That's a great question. But if you take, with the exception of Orban, all those leaders that you listed will not send somebody to jail for sending subliminal messages on television. And that's it. And I say I put Orban on the side. I have to confess, I don't know what Orban does.
Internally,
I know his positions on refugees, etc. But I'm not exactly sure what he does, and I don't want to be unfair to him. But look, whether it's Sarkozy or Narendra Modi or Bibi or none of these leaders, Trump hasn't come to power yet.
Yeah.
And the right wing in France, whether it's Marine Le Pen or the AfD in Germany, they're not in power, so we can't talk about that. But Sarkozy was in government, so we know what he did. He may be a populist, but he's a center-right populist. So there are still leaders who adhere to the basics of what we think is a democracy, in the sense that, yes, they've been in power. Well, Bibi has been in power for a long time. I mean, Sarkozy, remember, lost elections. And Modi is still in the first term, I believe. So they still need to prove themselves. But they all are coming from one, you're right in that perspective, they're all coming from one, we say, spectrum of politics, not the left, but the center-right, right? Center-right to right? So there is definitely a pattern here, and we're seeing it certainly in the United States. I mean, even if Trump were to lose elections, he's going to get 45%, maybe more of the American electorate will be voting for him. So in that sense, it is worrying, because these are leaders who are not, who have managed essentially to stay in power by building coalitions that are inherently far less open to debate, far less sympathetic, if you want, to other ideas so yes, there is certainly is a pattern. But Erdogan is different. I mean, Erdogan also exercises a kind of powers that are paradoxical, because constitutionally he has none of the powers that he essentially uses at the moment. He's done all of this through extra-constitutional means, and he's done it through this charismatic authority concept, whereby people defer to him because of who he is, rather than the position he occupies, right? So he thinks he is ahead of the judiciary. He thinks he's ahead of the legislative. He thinks that I mean, in his thinking, there is no separation of powers. He's the number one judge, the number one legislator, the number one decision maker, right? Executive. So, but he's none of those, right? Whereas when you look at the other leaders, I mean, they are all still confined by the constitutional boundaries that have been drawn. So Erdogan, in that sense, is unique. And secondly, Erdogan's repression is far. I mean, you don't see that kind of repression
more extensive
in the other countries.
Yeah. Well, it's been an honor hosting you here at the University of Denver for the last 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.